Okay. So welcome everybody to class number 23 in the online series, Parkinson School. This is perhaps one of my favorite courses of the year because I get to really be creative and fantasize about what I would do to cure Parkinson's disease if somebody declared me president of Parkinson's disease and gave me the resources to do everything I want to do. So this is my fantastical brainstorming session with all of you. And I would absolutely like your feedback as we go through this and as I wrap this up. So I believe you can all see my screen now, right? Can somebody acknowledge that the screen is visible?
First slide.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so here are my goals for this course. One, I want to kind of recap last year. I watched last year's class. Nothing is really that radically different. I hold by my definition of cure and my goals to overcome the stumbling blocks that have plagued us to date. I want to talk to you about some of my plans for next year, online Parkinson School, and I think we finally have dates for the in-person Parkinson School. So I'll talk to you all about that. This slide is from the original pre-recorded course. And again, if you haven't watched that class, for a couple years, it is a very comprehensive summary of all of the reasons that I believe we have made it 200 and some years into this disease, and we don't yet have a way to find the people who are going to be diagnosed, prevent people from being diagnosed, slow, stop, or reverse Parkinson's disease progression. Like I said, that's kind of the whole point of these courses is we're not going to go over the 101 level material again. We're going to kind of jump right into it. But for those of you who need a refresher course, I really do think it's a valuable course to go back and watch. So one of the biggest things is that we don't have a clinically relevant outcome measure. All of you who are part of the school know that I designed the ProPD. And the really big exciting news there for the 2022 update and where we're headed is we have a local community donor has given us enough money to turn the ProPD scale into an app. And so it will be available in the next couple of weeks. The iOS version just got released. We have a couple of people beta testing it. That should be available to go public in the next week or so. And the iOS version is scheduled to be beta tested today. So by the end of this year, everybody in the world will have access to a free iOS or Android version of the Parkinson ProPD app that would allow you to track your own symptoms. And the neat part is, what you do is right before you go to your neurologist or one of your other providers, you can push a button and it will give you a report, a PDF report, one page that you can either email or print out, and it will tell you how do you compare to other people diagnosed the same time as you, which of your symptoms are contributing most significantly to the overall Parkinson's symptom burden, what has your trend line, your rate of progression over time looked like, have there been any blips in the screen, are you getting better or worse compared to national averages? So what I'm hoping to do is start to build that into a currency. What you can do to help. It's free for those of you who are at all capable of downloading an app and playing around with it. Not only do we want your feedback, we'd like you to use it. We'd like you to share it with your docs. And the more we're open to changing it, we'll change colors, we'll change which variables are on there, we'll change whether or not there are anchors. We want to hear what we can do to serve you. How can we make this better? What do the doctors need to get it better? And we have a list of providers who are writing letters on our behalf saying that they want to see this integrated into their electronic medical record system. So I'm really excited about that. This is going to be a more relevant screen in the future, but what I want to show is this is how I use ProPD in clinic. Not all of you are my patients in private practice. But in private practice, what I do is each person who comes in, before they come in, I pull up their old scores. And I chart each person. I show them where they were when we started working together and how things have changed over time. It's like the stock market. It's going to be up and down. You know, people have good days and bad days, good weeks and bad weeks. But what we're looking for are these trend lines. So this is how I use it over time. And I do want to point out, and I will come back to this again, the trends. These are all people, these are the last, actually 9 of the last 10 patients I've seen. One of my patients has refused to do the Pro PD since we started working together and hasn't done it. But these happen to be 9 of the last 10 patients that I've seen. And I want to point out that this disease is supposed to be chronic, progressive, debilitating, and degenerative. And I would like you to notice that that's not the trend that I'm seeing in a lot of my patients. My patients are not getting worse at this expected 38 points per year. I am thrilled to report for the first time, I truly think we have enough data to now write up a clinical case series that shows that if you do the things the positive deviants are doing, that you too can slow Parkinson's progression. And I do believe that we are now sitting on the data that actually supports that claim. So like I said, the app is about to be available. The report comes with it, and we always want feedback on the scale, but especially this first couple of weeks after the app becomes available, we have a very short window with our app development team to provide feedback and ask for changes. So anyone, anyway, anyhow that you can email us feedback, we would love to hear it. I can give you my app email address at the end of this, and you can email that. And then for the quote unquote meat of today's talk, what I would really like to do is talk about Parkinson's disease from a slightly different perspective. I have been resurrecting my interest in the history of nutrition a little bit, and I've been really stuck on the human paradigm and perspective and the state of science that we find ourselves in. You know, I've been rereading the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and really kind of thinking about this trap that we get stuck in where you can only see something from one angle. And so Thomas Kuhn in the book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, basically argues if you are spending more and more and more time and money on a particular problem and not getting closer to the results, the problem is probably in the paradigm with which you are looking at it. And that is exactly what has happened with Parkinson's. For hundreds of years, we have been dumping careers and money and labs and countless amounts of effort into a paradigm that is not bearing fruit. So what I would like to do is kind of zoom out, zoom back, and look at Parkinson's a little bit differently. So what I want to do is give you an example of 2 different stories through history. So back in the 1800s in the Midwest, there was an epidemic of 2 things happening. Children being born with cretinism, which was basically thickening of facial features, short stature, intellectual disability, and a goiter. And this would eventually become to be known as the goiter belt across the northern strip of the United States. But it was back in the 1930s that was the first time we started noticing this epidemic of goiter in the northern half of the US, specifically Great Lakes, Appalachian Mountains, and Pacific Northwest, all along that northern strip. So much so that 25% to 70% of kids had goiter, right? And some physician, while he was screening for cadets to join World War I, noticed that 1/3 of the people he was screening had enlarged thyroid. And he took it upon himself to kind of start pushing some things along and started noticing that in places where where the salt was naturally iodized, they didn't have a goiter. And so that kind of was the first kind of whisperings of maybe iodine has something to do with preventing goiter or improving thyroid health. And so notice here, between the 1830s and now 1917 was the very first study where they began to say, can we give people iodine and see if that will make a difference in their goiters? And sure enough, 2,100 schoolgirls learned that the kids that were treated with iodine had 2% of them developed goiter versus more than 25% of the untreated kids. So throughout the Midwest, a couple of docs took it upon themselves to form some societies that made a call to the US government to form the iodized salt committee. And they started kind of pushing through legislation to try and formalize iodine fortification, which started to happen around the 1920s. And of course, there was resistance, right? The people in Arizona were like, what are we taking iodine for? What if it's bad for us? What if it hurts us? Maybe it's too much. I mean, these are good questions. And actually, when we did start iodine fortification, we kind of did screw up and we did overdose it a bit. And we did cause some thyroid problems because we overshot the target, right? And so the people who didn't need iodine both didn't want to pay for it and they didn't want to be dosed with something that they didn't need. So this isn't a far-fetched idea, you know, that kind of resistance and, you know, what's good for you is not necessarily good for me dates back centuries, right? Interestingly enough, to this day, iodine fortification of salt is not mandatory in the US. And about half, little more than half of the table salt brands tested in a recent sample had less than what the FDA recommended. So those of you who are using sea salt, many of you are not using iodized salt. And if you do live in the northern parts of the US, you may be still today susceptible to iodine deficiency. But it's a pretty fascinating story. And the lessons that I would like you to take back, I mean, hindsight is 2020. The lesson that I would like you to take away from the iodine deficiency story is one, the problem has to be really severe and really prevalent for people to even notice, let alone take action. I mean, you saw 50 to 70% of kids are being affected. I mean, major, major physical and intellectual disability. And that still took another 100 years. It only took one or two motivated people to make a stink, form committees, make calls for action, write bills, and get things, catalyze change. The response is ridiculously slow. And my favorite part is ultimately the evidence speaks for itself. As crazy of an idea as that may be, it was that study in school children that said, hey, it doesn't matter if it makes sense to you or not. If you do X, we improve health. And the data speaks for itself. And when the science is solid, I think the scientific community tends to respond favorably. The second example I'll give you is Pellagra, which was characterized as diarrhea, the 4 Ds, diarrhea, dementia, dermatitis, and eventually death. So Pellagra, you know, this is called Castle's necklace. This was a very, very common disease in the Mediterranean region in the 1700s. This was very problematic all throughout Spain and Italy. And I loved doing the math and realizing how young these kids were who started Pellagra hospitals for the people who were not being tended to by society. I mean, the conventional doctors didn't know what to do with them. And, you know, I just applaud, you know, 26 years old. I just keep thinking, you know, those people are barely out of undergrad now, you know, and we're wasting some of the ambition of youth in some of these. Anyway, so it took a couple more years to kind of start to realize that not everybody looks the same. It's possible to have diarrhea without dementia. It's possible to have dermatitis without diarrhea. That took a while for people to realize. And then what happened is, while this was happening in Europe, no one was really paying much attention to it. And then all of a sudden what happened is in the early, this was down around 1900, there was a, they noticed that there was an epidemic of pellagra happening now in the United States. And it is gut-wrenchingly horrific to actually read this report on pellagra. Last summer at the Mount Vernon Insane Hospital, the hospital for the colored insane in Alabama, there appeared to be a few cases of a disease which had been noticed every summer in patients that had been moved there from Tennessee, Tuscaloosa. And so some 3 or 4 cases of this disease would occur each summer until they usually proved fatal. But now all of a sudden they had an epidemic of 88 cases that were popping up all over the place. So they sent some doctors down to try and figure out what was going on. And long story short, they realized there were more than one form of this disease. While it was usually slow and chronic, sometimes it was acute. A lot of people had few symptoms. Every once in a while, somebody would have a ton of symptoms, and we're starting to appreciate, oh, look, it's not one size fits all. Not everyone doesn't manifest the same way. And they started talking in more general terms, like, hey, these people who are afflicted by this have disturbances of the neurologic system and the digestive tract. And they kind of started to hone in on what this is. As to its etiology, its relation to the continuous eating of damaged corn has long been recognized. Even back in Europe, hundreds of years ago, they linked it to eating corn. And poverty, poor hygiene, and exposure to the sun's rays have been given as predisposing factors. A number of writers ascribe the disease to certain toxic substances developed in the course of decomposition of the grain under the influence of vegetable organisms. Others attribute it to the organisms itself. This is pretty shocking. A sample of the meal used at the Mount Vernon Hospital, which was supposed to be the best Western meal, was sent to the pathologist in charge of the Laboratory of Plant Pathology at Washington, and he reported the meal wholly unfit for human use, that it was made of moldy grain and contained quantities of bacteria and fungi of various sorts, some of which were identified. Right? So we are talking hundreds of years after this has been affecting people. We now, hindsight is 2020, this was what, 120 years ago, now understand that if you don't get enough tryptophan, that it wasn't the organisms in the grain, but that by filling your diet full of corn, you don't get enough tryptophan or niacin. And that is ultimately what will cause the disease called pellagra. Interestingly enough, we are now studying niacin turning to NAD and its role in Parkinson's disease. And so this actually might all be a little more related to you than you realize. But we now know that it's not just poor people living off of corn, moldy corn diets. We now know that anybody whose gut is inflamed and not doing a great job absorbing their nutrients can be susceptible to this. So if you've had bariatric gastric bypass surgery, if you have celiac disease, if you have some malabsorption syndrome, you could also make yourself vulnerable to pellagra. There are even pharmaceutical medicines that can do this. And so the idea, like even to this day, if this person walked in to a dermatologist's office, I'm not sure that a doc would say, oh, I bet you have a vitamin B3 deficiency. It is really hard for physicians and sometimes even patients to realize something this severe can be just because there wasn't enough iodine in the salt. All of the time, I get these very dismissive responses of, oh, you believe in nutrients. Oh, you believe in the nutritional theory of disease. And I just cannot stress enough that nutrients are the exogenously required ingredients that make the body function. And if you don't get what you need, things start going awry. So with that in mind, my lessons with the pellagra epidemic were, youthful ambition is hindered by medical school. I really think by the time most people are out of medical school, they're exhausted. They've been spoon-fed this kind of incestuous sort of education where they have memorized and regurgitated the same information that the docs ahead of them had been getting wrong for the last 200 years. I mean, the people who are getting it wrong are training the next generation of docs, and we don't really have a system to introduce some fresh paradigms into the machinery here. It took decades for researchers and physicians to realize that not everybody with pellagra gets the same set of symptoms. I think it's amazing that moldy grain has been is still being implicated in ALS today. And it goes all the way back hundreds of years to the Mediterranean region. And I really hadn't appreciated how much of a theme that is throughout history. Which brings us to Parkinson's disease. And I've often had this kind of idea that I might get further if I just wrote this fictional book, like what's the movie where the asteroid is coming to Earth? Don't Look Up, right? Like I think that might be the best approach to take here with Parkinson's, is almost to create this fantastical post-Parkinson's world fictional story where we look back on that time when it took us a couple hundred years to figure this out. Right? We're living it right now, and we don't have another 50 or 100 years or decades to sit around, keep moving forward at the pace that nutrition research has been moving forward. So if I were writing 40 years from now, looking back on the Parkinson's era, it would start back in 1817 when the very first essay of shaking palsy was written. And it is impressive that even back then, more than 200 years ago, they called out constipation, trouble swallowing, difficulty writing, excessive drooling, a hastening, hurrying gait. Intellect is largely preserved, right? Of course, they're recommending things like mercury and substances that cause blistering as therapeutic options, just to kind of give you an idea of how far we've come. But this is kind of when the clock started. I will then, fast forward 144 years later was the very first time a person with Parkinson's was given dopamine in any form. It was intravenously. And we futzed around for several years until 1967, when they actually started putting levodopa with carbidopa. No, what they did in 1967 was found that if you sneak it in and start with low doses and gradually increase it, that's when you get consistent results. Prior to that, it was very hit or miss. Patients would walk in, the doc would give them a bunch of dopamine, they may or may not respond, and the data was essentially equivocal. When they found out that if you start with baby doses and increase it slowly, that's where you start to get reliably good results. And then 1975 was when they actually partnered it with carbidopa levodopa. And we had what really essentially became the first very clinically useful therapeutic tool. So 1817 to 1975 for our first symptomatic medicine, right? So in hindsight, what will history say? What we have learned between 1975, 1980, and now is that Parkinson's disease is a condition that affects primarily people of age. Kids don't get Parkinson's. The older you get, the more likely you are to get a diagnosis. It tends to affect men more than women. Pesticide exposure, dairy exposure, melanoma, traumatic brain injuries, people who eat red meat, pork, processed grains, soda, fried food are the ones who are most likely to get it. The people who go on to get Parkinson's and have the worst outcomes tend to lead sedentary lifestyles. Outcomes tend to be worse in people who are poor and lonely. And there seems to be something about this ambitious, loyal, dutiful personality type that is somehow characteristic in a disproportionate number of people. So this is getting us into my answer key, my goals, what I've done for this past year and what I plan to do for next year. But I now feel really confident with our data to be able to say that the people who are doing the best, these are the things that they are doing. And I don't know why. I don't know which one of these things is most useful. I don't know if some fresh vegetables are better than other fresh vegetables. I don't know if the only reason that vitamin C is helpful is because the people who take vitamin C are also taking glutathione, and it's not really the vitamin C, but the glutathione. I mean, there could be a million explanations, and this could be a surrogate for all kinds of other stuff. But I can tell you with 95% confidence that the more of these things a person does, the less progressive their disease. right? And so my goal, and so you've all seen these charts before, where this is the year where we are getting really, really clear on there are some things that people can do that we now have the data to support. It's slowing Parkinson's progression. Here is a list of the foods and food behaviors. I'll make these PDFs downloadable and put them on the chart so that you can download them. I would love to turn this into a refrigerator magnet for everybody. But I'll just run through it right now. I mean, we know that the more fresh fruits and vegetables, brown rice, oats, coconut oil, olive oil, nuts and seeds, eggs, fresh herbs and spices, wine, and green tea a person eats, the fewer symptoms they have over time. And the people who are doing the best statistically are more likely to say true to these statements. I avoid soda. I regularly eat buckwheat. I avoid dairy. I regularly eat farro. I avoid artificial sweeteners and beef. I only consume gluten-free bread and bread products. I avoid artificial colors and flavors. I routinely prepare meals for others. I try to eat organic when possible. I am a vegetarian. I eat quinoa. I avoid pork, and I use spices liberally. I do not think that every one of you needs to say true to all of those things, but as we swim in a sea of a really scary, quote unquote, degenerative disease that we don't have any cure for, it's still my opinion that you all should do what the people who are doing the best are doing. And this is what they are doing. Here's a list of supplements. This paper is under review, but I've showed you this is from the abstract. Again, I'll say it loud and clear. Just because it's on this list does not mean that everybody with Parkinson's should be taking these. This isn't a shopping list. Not some of these are contraindicated for some of you. But for those of you who are saying, hey, are there any supplements that might be associated with improving my outcomes over time? This is the list that you should talk to your doc about. Are there pros? Are there cons? Let's consider me using some of these supplements. Like I said, just like they did with the iodine studies, I would like to not just have my verbal opinion out in the world that I'm seeing good results. This is the year where I actually want to take what I've been working on and turn it into published data. I did this for 3 weeks in my practice. I got data earlier this year. I got data that said in the United States and Canada, when we look at people progressing over time, that's where I showed you that curve that goes up at 38 points per year. In spite of that increase that happens in the general Parkinson's population, 7% of people in the US and Canada are actually staying the same or getting better over time. And so I, being competitive, it's like, well, if 7% of doctors are having improvements with their patients, my patients better be at least 15%, right? You're wasting your time and money if I'm not at least doubling the likelihood of you not progressing. That was my thinking. So for 3 weeks, every single person who came in, I drew their little map like this. And 72.5% of the patients that I had seen in those 3 weeks had been stable or better than they were when we started. I don't think that I am offering anything magic. I mean, I think there's maybe a little placebo in here, but I don't know if it's the glutathione or the fish oil or the exercise or the diet or the belief, my belief in the fact that I truly believe this is a modifiable disease. I'm not sure what's working so well, and it is absolutely a biased sample. People who are not getting good results don't come back to me, right? So I am only seeing the people who like the results they're getting and they want to keep getting more of it. So what we need to do, but either way, it is enough data to be able to say in a disease that is only supposed to get worse over time, if we can find anybody or any clinic in the world who can say 70% of our patients are not actually progressing, I believe that actually is enough to create a stir and start asking some questions about what is this which part of this might be working. Can we package it? Can we deliver it? Can it be taught? Can it be scaled? To sum up what I feel like I've accomplished most this past year, we got a paper published showing that childhood trauma impacts the type of Parkinson's symptoms that you have in adulthood. That paper has been accepted but not published yet. I'll let you know as soon as it has been published. Just last Friday, we got a paper published comparing the Mediterranean diet to the MIND diet. The MIND is better. I'll go over those results with you in a second. We have 2 papers that are already under review, one showing NAD deficiency and one review on nutrition and non-motor symptoms. And we have 2 more papers that are going to go out before the end of the year, one validating the PRO-PD scale and one on nutraceuticals. We got 1 grant and we have another one going out in January. Excuse me. The PRO-PD, in addition to my own studies that I'm using it for, has been translating to Swedish, and they've used it in a bunch of COVID studies and wearable studies this year. A couple industry-sponsored trials are using the PRO-PD, and a bunch of clinics have asked to start using the app in their practice. So I'm excited about that. The app's about to be released. And the other thing I've done this year, some of you know about, is my computer, I wear a lot of different hats. I see patients, I do research, I'm doing this app development stuff, I'm training dogs to smell Parkinson's, and my laptop is a little bit like air traffic control, juggling a bunch of balls. And so I am moving, one of my goals over the next couple of years will be to coalesce a lot of my efforts under one hat. And I formed something called the Parkinson Center for Pragmatic Research, the Parkinson CPR. So I hope that that becomes a leader in the field over the next few years. Here's the paper we just got published on Friday, a comparison of the Mediterranean and the MIND diet. Basically, it shows that they are both associated with fewer Parkinson's symptoms over time, with the MIND points being twice as strong as the Mediterranean points. So you can kind of see why the pink is the Mediterranean, and that kind of just reflects the general population. So what that's saying is, as we go up in Mediterranean points, it's good, but really the money is going up in MIND points. That's where you see the real benefit. So it's something about this upper end where we're seeing the biggest difference. As you can see, this is Parkinson's symptom score, and this is your adherence to a Mediterranean diet. For any person in our study, the more adherent they are to a Mediterranean diet, the fewer symptoms they have. That is even more true, twice as true, for each increase in MIND adherence point. So for those of you who are curious about what is a MIND diet, how is it different? It is essentially not just recommending vegetables, but green leafy vegetables. Not just recommending fruit, but a real emphasis on berries, a greater emphasis on legumes and nuts, and no cheese. They also say, I'll just tell you that they do give you points for poultry, but according to our data, that was not helpful in Parkinson's. The MIND diet actually would have been a little bit stronger if it didn't have the poultry part. So, I think it's fair to say a MIND diet without the poultry is probably a really good way to go. So, I'm still going to argue that the Parkinson's diet that we're putting together, I still hope and predict will be better than the MIND. But for those of you who keep asking for cookbooks and recipe books, a really good place to start right now is to order some MIND cookbooks. There really are a lot of good ones out there, and we are getting closer and closer to what an ideal diet for Parkinson's should look like. Very specifically and very interestingly, some symptoms are more associated with benefit than others. The more adherent you are to the MIND diet, the place we really saw the biggest benefit, improvements in constipation, motivation, depression, apathy, daytime sleepiness, sleep improved, muscle pain improved, memory and forgetfulness, and comprehension. So cognitive improvements. Right? These are some of the things that are hardest to treat. This is what has escaped conventional medicine. This is the stuff that is not helped by dopamine. And we're presenting data here showing that there's something about this type of diet that seems to be therapeutic. And when you consider it in the context of things like Pellagra and iodine, it's not that far-fetched of a concept that there could be something in the mind diet that is actually curative. So my goals for 2023 will be to define and publish the official, like, what does the data say is the best diet for people with Parkinson's, and actually develop a rating scale, just like the MIND diet has a rating scale and the Mediterranean diet has a rating scale. We need a Parkinson's diet rating scale so that you all can report what you're eating and know whether or not you get 6 points or 12 points or 2 points, right? And so that has kind of been a little bit of a sticky project, but I'm committed to doing that this year. I actually believe that we have enough data now from enough of you over time to answer the question, if somebody changes their lifestyle, does it change their rate of progression? And that's going to require some fancy statistics, but a couple of you have donated some money to the MVP study this year, and we now are in a position to hire statisticians and get some of this research done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And the competitive part of me would love to compare the outcomes I'm getting in my practice to centers of excellence and standard of care. I would love to do a head-to-head study. So I think we might have enough data to be able to do that analysis, and I'm excited to do that. And I am absolutely okay learning that I'm getting worse outcomes than them. If I am, then I need to change course. I need to rethink my strategy and do something different. I think part of being a good scientist is being willing to learn when you are wrong. So I'm willing to learn that I am not as good as I think I am, and that I need to rethink my approach to Parkinson's disease. And so I am excited to start to have those conversations. I will maybe hopefully get the dog detection project off the ground this year. That is a way bigger project, and we'll table that one towards the end. But even more exciting is now that this app is about to be released, we are already getting feedback and getting ready to go with app 2.0. And that's not just going to be a rating scale, but a disease modification strategy. What I am hoping for is that each person can kind of get their score. I realize they're starting around a 500. And then what will happen is maybe once a week, you answer a series of questions. You know, how many servings of fresh vegetables did you have in the last 24 hours? How many times did you socialize with friends in the last 7 days? How many minutes of intense, aggressive, forced exercise did you get in the last 7 days? And you can answer a series of very simple questions, and we can see the computer will have this evidence-based, scientifically derived equation that goes d. You keep this kind of behavior up, and this is what you can expect your trajectory to look like over the next 10 years. We have the data to tell you. The people who are not exercising, who are eating fried food, who don't have any friends, they're not socializing, we now have the data to predict what their course of trajectory is slated to look like if they keep those behaviors up. Conversely, the app will provide some sort of feedback where if you drank a bunch of wine and ate a bunch of Brussels sprouts and hung out with your friends and took your CoQ10, keep that up. And this is what your 10-year trajectory is scheduled to look like. What I'm trying to do is give some scientifically sound evidence-based feedback today that will change the slope of your progression over time. And so we're working out the math and the algorithm between how to assign points for this. You know, this is what the report looks like. So what happens, I don't think I showed a picture of this earlier, but for the app that's already available in the next week or so, this is what the report looks like that you can bring to your dog. Here's how I compare to other people my age. When you zoom in, I'm in the good zone, that'll be moved to the middle. And then here's kind of like a zoomed out. Here's what symptoms are most impactful, you know, in what domain: motor, psychological, autonomic, and then a list of which symptoms are getting better and which symptoms are getting worse. So that is where I plan to go in 2023, redefine Parkinson's, introduce a new rating scale, introduce a new currency for researchers, clinicians, and patients to be able to track and monitor their Parkinson's disease, and turn all of the data that we have collected with the MVP study into a mathematical algorithm that will help you make better decisions today that will improve your outcomes over time. Lastly, just to say for a couple minutes, a lot of people have been asking what's up with Parkinson's Online School 2023, and I think we're starting to dial it in. I am going to continue doing the talk on the 28th of every month. I will do a monthly wrap up every month. I will continue to be the speaker for that. I will show up with new data and what I'm working on and what's come out in that last month. I'm going to not stick with the same topics. I'm going to stir it up a little bit. There have been a lot of questions about bone health and some of the new drugs that have come out and all kinds of new stuff that I just want to break the mold and stir things up a little bit. So I will do some new topic once a month. We are going to do a speaker series. We have volunteers who have offered to speak for the first 3 months. So the 14th of every month will be a person with Parkinson's who sort of tells their story beginning to end. Here's how I came to get diagnosed. Here's what I've learned along the way. Here are my setbacks. Here's how I overcame them. And here's how you all can be inspired and learn from my foibles and successes. And so that anyone who is interested in signing up and wants to contribute, please speak up, send us an email, volunteer. We'd love it. But just to get the ball rolling, the first 3 months are filled. John has offered to kind of host some sort of everyone learns to play a new musical instrument. There are a couple musicians on this team on this club who are excited about finding some way to exercise neuroplasticity through music. There's a Spanish group that's starting up on the first Monday or Tuesday of every month. And some other folks have mentioned that they wanted a trauma group, a cooking group, a care partner support group. Say the word. You pick a time and the room is yours. We'll set it up on a calendar and anyone who wants to join can join anytime they want. And it is my understanding that after last month's course, a bunch of people decided to meet every Tuesday at 1 o'clock and just kind of have a hodgepodge conversation of informal, let's just talk about anything we want to talk about. And I believe a few people have been meeting on Tuesday afternoons just regularly. And then, as I said, in terms of Parkinson's camp, for those of you who have been asking, I think what we're going to do is break this into 2 sections. One for the newbies who have never come to camp before, kind of the orientation, welcome to the system, here's how to drink the Kool-Aid, sort of thing. And then for people who have come to one of the camps in prior years, it'll be kind of an update, reunion. Where are we at? What have we learned? How can we kind of not lose what we've already gained? And so there'll be a level 2, sort of a weekend sort of thing on August 5th and 6th at the request of prior attendees. So that's what it's kind of looking like right now. So I will stop sharing and open the conversation up to anyone with questions or ideas or feedback or opinions or